What if I told you that the greatest symbol of Victorian progress was not the glittering railway stations, the grand museums, or even the gaslit boulevards, but the overwhelming stench of rotting filth that choked the air of every major city? We have been conditioned by period dramas and romantic literature to envision the Victorian era through a lens of sepia-toned elegance. Ladies in silk gowns gliding through drawing rooms, gentlemen in top hats stepping from polished carriages, and fog rolling picturesquely through cobbled streets. This carefully constructed image represents one of history's most successful cover-ups, a collective amnesia that has allowed us to forget a simple, horrifying truth. If you could step through time into the streets of 1850s London, the first sensation to assault you would not be the sight of architectural grandeur or the sound of industrial progress. It would be the smell, a thick, sour, inescapable stench that would cling to your clothes, burn your throat, and follow you into your nightmares. The smell of open sewers flowing through city centers, of millions of pounds of horse manure carpeting every street, of coal smoke so dense it turned day to night, of human waste bubbling up through floorboards, and of rivers that had become liquid graveyards. A smell so powerful that Victorians believed it could kill you with a single breath. This was not the smell of poverty confined to distant slums. This was the smell of an entire civilization that had grown faster than its ability to manage its own waste. The rich Victorian lifestyle was not a fairy tale of leisure and refinement. It was a desperate daily battle against a rising tide of filth that threatened to drown the very foundations of their society. To understand the Victorians, we must stop looking at their polished facades and start examining their refuse. We must peel back the heavy velvet curtains of respectability to reveal the cesspool bubbling just beneath their feet. Today, we are going to walk through that world of stench, to meet the people who lived and died in it, and to understand how the greatest cities on earth, at the height of their power, came to smell like death itself. Chapter 1. The Fade of Victorian Luxury, a World of Illusions. Picture a winter evening in 1850s London. Gas lamps flicker to life along a fashionable street in Belgravia, their yellow halos struggling against the thick, gray fog that clings to everything like a living entity. A carriage pulls up before a tall white townhouse, its wheels crunching over cobblestones that glisten with moisture and something darker, more viscous. The door swings open, releasing a burst of warm light and the gentle strains of a waltz drifting from within. Crystal chandeliers illuminate marble tiles, polished brass gleams, and silk gowns swirl in the ballroom above. If you froze this scene in a painting, it would epitomize Victorian elegance and order. But now, instead of merely looking, imagine breathing. The perfume and cigar smoke in the ballroom cannot quite mask the sour edge of too many unwashed bodies pressed into overheated rooms. Beneath the polished wood and floral arrangements lurks something more persistent, the damp, musty odor of coal dust, old pipework, and the faint but unmistakable smell of decay rising from the basement below. Step outside and the full assault begins. The mud coating the streets is not the honest earth of the countryside, but a unique urban compound created by the 50,000 horses working in London daily. Each horse produced 20 to 30 pounds of manure every single day. Mathematics reveals the staggering reality: over 1 million pounds of fresh dung deposited onto London streets each day. In dry weather, this manure transformed into a choking, pungent dust that coated the back of your throat and settled on your food. When it rained, it became a slippery, ankle-deep quagmire that splashed onto everything it touched. The air itself was a toxic cocktail. The infamous London pea soupers were not merely romantic fog, but a deadly mixture of coal smoke, industrial chemicals, and the miasma rising from the Thames. Londoners burned coal at an unprecedented rate to fuel their steam engines and warm their drafty homes. The smoke contained sulfur dioxide, which mixed with moisture in the lungs to form mild sulfuric acid. Every breath in a Victorian city was an act of slow self-poisoning. But the true horror lay in what you could not see. The grand townhouses of Mayfair and Belgravia, the very symbols of Victorian prosperity, were built over cesspools, brick-lined pits where human waste accumulated for weeks or months at a time. London alone contained over 200,000 of these festering vats, many located directly beneath drawing rooms and kitchens. The wealthy believed their money insulated them from the squalor of the streets, but the danger was not outside their doors, it was underneath their feet. The Victorian mistress of the house became an archetype of quiet desperation, waging constant warfare against the invasion of smells. She ordered scented soaps, dried flowers, and potpourri. She insisted on cleanliness and discipline from her servants. Yet for all her lace and etiquette, she could not escape living in a city where millions of people and animals produced more filth each day than any existing system could manage. Her carefully maintained world of refinement was a stage set built over a foundation of rot. The architecture itself participated in this grand deception. Neo-Gothic towers and marble statues screamed order, while the air whispered chaos. The Victorians constructed a visual language of power and permanence to deny the olfactory reality of decay and impermanence. But smells were harder to control than sights, and the carefully managed theater of luxury depended entirely on an invisible army of workers who dealt with what the rich preferred not to acknowledge. As the candles burned low in the drawing rooms above, and the wealthy retired to their perfumed chambers, another world stirred to life in the darkness below. A world where people spent their entire existence managing the waste that made civilized life possible. To understand why Victorian cities smelled like death, we must descend into that shadow realm and meet the people who worked while the city slept. Chapter 2. The Invisible World. Servants Behind the Curtain. When darkness fell over the Victorian metropolis and gas lamps cast dancing shadows against soot-stained brickwork, a different army mobilized. The aristocracy retreated to their beds, pulling heavy covers tight against the damp chill. But for the city to function even one more day, the invisible workers had to emerge from the shadows. Enter the night soil men, perhaps the most essential yet reviled workers in Victorian society. These teams of laborers would arrive under cover of darkness with carts and buckets, tasked with emptying the cesspools that lay beneath every household, from the grandest estates to the humblest tenements. The work could only be performed at night, when the smell would be less offensive to public sensibilities, and when the darkness could hide the shameful reality of what kept the city functioning. The moment of opening a cesspool was an olfactory assault beyond modern comprehension. Methane gas accumulated to such dangerous levels that holding a lantern too close could trigger explosions, blowing the floorboards of wealthy homes clean off their joists. The night soil men would descend into brick-lined pits, where the fumes burned their eyes and seared their throats, using long ladles to scoop the night soil into wicker baskets. They would then carry this slop through pristine hallways, past velvet drapes and polished furniture, out to waiting carts that would rumble away into the darkness. Imagine the cognitive dissonance required for a household to pretend this was not happening. Servants would remain awake, ensuring the night soil men did not track filth onto carpets, sprinkling chloride of lime to mask the stench that inevitably lingered long after the carts disappeared. The waste was then transported to the city's edges, sold to farmers as fertilizer, or more often simply dumped into the Thames or onto massive heaps that ringed London like a necklace of rot. But the night soil men were not alone in this underground economy of filth. Down by the Thames, in the few ancient sewers that did exist, lived the toshers, scavengers who waded through raw sewage in search of anything valuable. Dressed in heavy coats with large pockets and carrying lanterns strapped to their chests, they hunted for tosh, copper nails, coins, jewelry, or any metal that had been washed down the drains. They knew the tides of the subterranean world, understood that sudden rainstorms could send walls of water rushing through tunnels, drowning them instantly. They fought off swarms of rats so bold and numerous, they would attack men in packs. Even more specialized were the pure finders, elderly women and the desperately poor who scoured the streets collecting dog feces to sell to tanneries. Pure, as dog dung was politely termed, was essential for the leather industry, its alkaline properties used to soften hides for the gloves and boots of the wealthy. The pristine white gloves worn by a debutante at a society ball were prepared using filth scraped from the streets by the poorest of the poor. This invisible world of labor was the engine room that kept Victorian civilization running. It was a system that relied on human bodies to move human waste, inefficient, dangerous, and fundamentally broken. London's population had exploded from 1 million in 1800 to nearly 3 million by 1850, and the medieval systems of cesspools and night carts were collapsing under the sheer weight of numbers. The ground was becoming saturated with waste, cesspools were leaking into water tables, and wells were being poisoned. The servants, the night soil men, and the toshers all knew the system was failing. They saw the cracks in the foundation, smelled the change in the air, witnessed the increasing frequency of overflows and contamination. But the masters of the houses, the politicians in parliament, and the captains of industry remained committed to maintaining the illusion that their elaborate rituals of cleanliness and etiquette could hold back the tide of filth. Yet biology does not respect social hierarchies, and the carefully constructed barriers between classes were about to prove utterly useless against the forces gathering in the darkness below. The wealthy had created an elaborate system of denial, a complex dance of manners and sense designed to filter out reality. But as the pressure built in the cesspools and the Thames grew more toxic each day, their rituals of refinement were about to become a prison of their own making. Chapter 3. The Rituals of the Elite. How etiquette became a prison. To understand the psychological prison the Victorian elite constructed for themselves, we must examine their daily rituals through the lens of terror. The Victorians lived in mortal fear of miasma, the dominant medical theory that held diseases were caused by bad air, noxious vapors rising from decaying matter. If you could smell something foul, you were literally inhaling death. This belief transformed every aspect of upper-class life into an elaborate defense against invisible airborne killers. Consider the morning routine of a Victorian lady of standing. She wakes in a four-poster bed, surrounded by heavy damask curtains, which serve not merely as decoration, but as a fortress against the night air that Victorians believed carried sickness. The room remains sealed, windows rarely open, creating a stuffy, recycled atmosphere. But in a city built on cesspools, sealing a house creates a pressure cooker where smells from basement kitchens, coal fires, and hidden drains seep upward, trapped by the very measures taken to keep outside air out. Her morning ablutions become an exercise in olfactory warfare. She washes with heavily scented soaps, lavender, rose, bergamot, cloying fragrances designed to mask rather than merely please. When she dresses, she layers herself in fabrics, crinolines, petticoats, heavy wools, and silks, creating a textile armor against the environment. Before venturing outside, she arms herself with weapons against the stench: a vinaigrette, a small silver or gold box containing a sponge soaked in vinegar and aromatic oils, suspended from a chain. This serves as her personal gas mask. Walking through the city becomes a navigation exercise through a minefield of odors. When the wind shifts and brings the scent of the Thames or a passing night soil cart, she lifts the vinaigrette to her nose, inhaling sharp vinegar to burn out the smell of decay. She might also carry a tussie-mussie, a small bouquet held close to the face, serving as a mobile air filter. The very etiquette of movement, the routes chosen, the way one held a handkerchief, all became strategies for survival in a toxic environment. Social gatherings took place in parlors filled with potpourri, burning pastilles, and heavy floral arrangements, creating artificial microclimates of sweetness within the city of rot. But this obsession with masking smells led to fatal blindness. Because they believed the smell was the killer, they focused entirely on the air while ignoring the water. They drank from crystal glasses filled with water drawn from wells sitting next to leaking cesspools. They ate food prepared in basement kitchens where drains backed up during high tide, ingesting death with every meal while practicing immaculate surface cleanliness. The etiquette became a prison because it demanded a performance of ignorance. To acknowledge the smell, was to acknowledge the failure of their civilization. To speak of drains was vulgar. To complain of cesspools was to admit one's home was not a sanctuary. So they suffered in perfumed silence, fainting in church not just from tight corsets, but from the stifling lack of oxygen and chemical fumes, rising from crypts where bodies were interred beneath floorboards. Even death contributed to the problem. London's graveyards were overflowing, bodies stacked deep, and in summer heat, gases from decomposition would bubble up through the ground. Sextons drilled holes into coffins to release gas and prevent explosions, releasing stenches that could clear a church service in minutes. The wealthy were trapped in a system of their own making, possessing the money to buy perfume, but unable to purchase clean air, wielding the power to build empires, but incapable of flushing a toilet that went anywhere but down into darkness, waiting to return. As the summer of 1858 approached, the tension was building toward a crisis that would shatter every illusion the Victorian elite had constructed. The cesspools were full to overflowing. The Thames had become a solid mass of filth, and the sun was preparing to transform their carefully perfumed world into a hell that no amount of lavender or vinegar could mask. The invisible enemy was gathering its strength, and it was about to launch an assault that would bring the British Empire to its knees. Chapter 4: The Great Stink and the Moment of Truth. The summer of 1858 arrived like a biblical plague upon London. A heat wave of unprecedented intensity descended upon the city, baking the brickwork, turning cobbled streets into ovens, and transforming the Thames into something that defied description. Under the relentless sun, the river, bloated with decades of untreated sewage, animal carcasses, and industrial waste, began to ferment. The bacteria went into overdrive, and the Thames ceased to be water, becoming instead a living, breathing entity of decay. The smell that rose from the riverbanks was unlike anything in recorded human history. It was not merely an odor, but a physical force, a presence that could tarnish silver in riverside dining rooms and induce nausea at distances of several miles. This was the Great Stink, the moment when the contrarian truth became undeniable and the myth of Victorian control shattered completely. The crisis reached its peak when the stench invaded the Houses of Parliament, located directly on the Thames embankment. Imagine the scene: the most powerful men in the world, rulers of an empire spanning the globe, attempting to debate the fate of nations while gagging on the smell of their own waste. Dignitaries were seen clutching handkerchiefs to their faces, eyes streaming, rushing from the chamber. The Chancellor of the Exchequer abandoned his post entirely. Desperate measures were attempted. Heavy curtains soaked in chloride of lime were hung over parliamentary windows, but the smell permeated stone, wood, and the very fabric of their clothes. There was serious discussion of moving the government to Oxford or St. Albans. The ultimate humiliation: the British government, which had defeated Napoleon and ruled the seas, brought to its knees by its own excrement. While politicians choked on the stench, a far deadlier drama played out in the streets. The Victorians feared the smell because of miasma theory, but the true killer was invisible and odorless: cholera. This disease struck with terrifying speed, transforming healthy individuals into blue-skinned corpses within hours, earning the nickname the Blue Death. For decades, the medical establishment had insisted cholera spread through bad air, but one contrarian had already seen the truth. Dr. John Snow, 4 years before the Great Stink, had done something revolutionary during the 1854 Soho outbreak. He used data. Mapping the deaths, he traced the outbreak not to wind patterns but to water sources, specifically the Broad Street pump. When he removed the pump handle, cases plummeted. Snow argued the disease was waterborne, spread through ingestion of contaminated water, a grotesque truth that people were dying because they were consuming their own waste. During the Great Stink, Snow's theories remained controversial, but the undeniable reality of the river forced a convergence of fear. Whether the threat was miasma or germs, the solution was identical: the sewage had to be removed. The terror that summer was palpable, not just discomfort, but psychological horror that the end times had arrived. Preachers declared the stench God's wrath upon a sinful city. The rich fled to the countryside, abandoning their townhouses, while the poor, trapped in the sweltering metropolis, died in thousands, bodies piling up faster than sextons could bury them. This was the climax of the Victorian struggle, the moment when facade crumbled and rituals proved useless. The city lay bare as a festering wound, revealing the brutal truth that civilization requires functional plumbing. You cannot sustain art, science, and empire while living in a sewer. From this nightmare emerged an unlikely hero, not a general or monarch, but a civil engineer named Joseph Bazalgette, tasked with the seemingly impossible mission of retrofitting the largest, most chaotic city on Earth with a modern circulatory system. But as we shall see, the solution to the Great Stink was not merely a triumph of engineering. It was an exercise in power that came at a brutal cost, and the smell of death did not simply vanish. It was strategically relocated to those who lacked the political influence to resist. Chapter 5. Engineering Salvation and Its Hidden Costs. Joseph Bazalgette's response to the Great Stink was audacious in scope and revolutionary in concept. He proposed to build massive intercepting sewers, underground highways of brick that would run parallel to the Thames, catching sewage before it could flow into the river. These sewers would then transport waste miles downstream beyond city limits to be discharged into the river on outgoing tides that would sweep it out to sea. The project required 318 million bricks and fundamentally altered London's geography. The Victoria Embankment, that grand promenade visitors walk today, is actually the roof of Bazalgette's massive sewer system. Construction involved digging up the heart of London, creating the greatest civil engineering project of the 19th century. When the system finally became operational, the effects were miraculous. Cholera outbreaks ceased, the Great Stink dissipated, and the Thames slowly began to recover. Death rates plummeted dramatically. Bazalgette saved more lives than any Victorian monarch or military leader. However, this triumph came with hidden costs that reveal the darker side of Victorian progress. The construction process was violent urban surgery that displaced thousands of poor families whose tenements were demolished, often with minimal notice or compensation. The progress of the city literally bulldozed working-class homes to make way for infrastructure that primarily benefited the wealthy. More significantly, Bazalgette's solution was not to treat the waste, but simply to relocate it. The sewage was pumped downstream to areas like Barking and Crossness, poor industrial communities that became the new repositories for London's filth. The stench that had terrorized parliamentarians at Westminster was exported to the doorsteps of the working poor in the East End. The smell of death had not disappeared. It had been gentrified out of the city center. This pattern of displacement reflected broader Victorian attitudes toward poverty and sanitation. The association between poverty, filth, and disease became deeply ingrained in middle-class consciousness. The poor were not merely unfortunate, they were seen as inherently dirty, their condition viewed as both cause and symptom of moral failings. This attitude justified neglect and discrimination while motivating some reforms, not from pure altruism, but from fear that disease would spread from poor neighborhoods to wealthy ones. The technological solutions developed during this era continue to serve London today. Bazalgette's tunnels, built in the 1860s, still carry sewage, supplemented by newer systems to accommodate population growth. This longevity testifies to Victorian engineering prowess. While highlighting a sobering reality, we continue grappling with the fundamental challenge of managing human waste in densely populated areas. The problem remains essentially unchanged, only our methods have evolved. The Victorian experience offers profound lessons for contemporary urban development. It demonstrates the dangers of rapid urbanization without adequate infrastructure planning, shows how incorrect scientific theories can still motivate beneficial action, and reveals the complex interplay between public health, social inequality, and political will. Most importantly, It reminds us that problems we consider solved are often merely managed, that systems we take for granted required enormous sacrifice to create, and that maintaining them demands constant vigilance and investment. The wealthy Victorian elite eventually escaped the stench that had defined their cities, returning to their balls and teas without vinaigrettes, reclaiming the illusion of a pristine world. But the infrastructure enabling their comfort was built on displacement of the poor and maintained by invisible labor of workers in dangerous tunnel systems. Their rigid social rules and obsession with cleanliness were psychological dams held against floods of sewage. Their stiff upper lips necessities when opening one's mouth meant tasting cesspool air. As we examine this history, we see a society capable of building the Crystal Palace, yet incapable for decades of preventing its citizens from drinking their own waste. We see a civilization that produced great literature while slowly poisoning itself with coal smoke. The beauty of Victorian architecture remains inseparable from the suffering required to build it. The politeness of their society inseparable from the horror they desperately tried to ignore. So why did Victorian cities smell like death? They reeked of mortality because they overflowed with life. More people, more waste, more industry than existing systems could safely manage. They smelled like death because filth accumulated where people had the least power to resist it. They stank of decay because progress raced ahead of responsibility, because the age that believed it was conquering nature was drowning in its own byproducts. The Victorians eventually conquered their great stink through brick and mortar, but victory was neither complete nor permanent. As cities in developing countries face sanitation challenges eerily similar to Victorian London, and climate change threatens existing infrastructure in developed nations, we are reminded that the battle against urban filth is never truly won. Each generation must fight it anew, building on past lessons while confronting new challenges. When you envision the Victorian era now, do not think only of top hats and corsets. Remember the night soil men laboring in darkness, the toshers fighting rats for copper coins, the pure finders scraping dog waste from streets. Remember the smell, because that stench of industrialization, rapid growth, and unchecked consumption is not merely history. It is a warning that you cannot hide indefinitely from the consequences of your own waste. You can spray perfume, close curtains, build high walls, but eventually the river rises, the wind changes, and the truth emerges. The Victorian city smelled like death because it was vibrantly, chaotically, dangerously alive, with energy we still struggle to control. They solved their crisis with engineering genius, but as we examine our own modern cities, our pollution, our invisible waste streams, we must ask, what is the smell we are trying to ignore today? What is our generation's great stink that we mask with our own versions of lavender and vinegar? The history of the senses tells us truth is often right under our noses. We need only courage to take a breath and confront what we find there. If this journey into history's hidden underbelly changed how you imagine the past, share your thoughts about what other historical myths deserve examination. Because history is rarely as clean as popular culture suggests, and the most important lessons often emerge from the shadows we prefer not to illuminate.